In 1977, a chilly autumn settled over the small town of Amityville, Long Island, New York. A new family moved into the house at 112 Ocean Avenue. They were the Lutz family, consisting of Father George, Mother Kathy, and 3 young children, Daniel, Christopher, and Melissa. For the privacy of those involved, we will call them the Bakers. On the first day of moving in, the atmosphere in the house seemed a bit heavy. But Kathy Baker, a gentle mother, quickly dispelled that feeling with a warm smile. "How do you like the new house? It's much more spacious than our old one, right?" she said, wiping the sweat from her forehead. George Baker, a strong man, was trying to move the large refrigerator into the kitchen, nodding slightly in agreement with his wife. "That's right, Kathy. For this bargain price, we got a wonderful house." As night fell, strange noises began to appear. At first there were only soft knocks, as if someone was knocking on the door, but there was no one outside. Daniel, the eldest son, leaned back into his mother's arms, his eyes wide as he looked around the room. "Mommy, I hear something." Kathy hugged him tightly, trying to reassure him. "It must be the wind. Honey, the new house has a lot of space, so the wind is blowing in." On the second night, things got worse. The noises were no longer gentle knocks, but loud, pounding sounds against the walls and floors. The furniture in the children's bedroom shook and fell to the ground. Christopher, the second son, burst into tears. "I'm scared, Mom. Something's in our house." George Baker began to feel uneasy. He walked around the house, checking every corner, but found no sign of forced entry. All the doors were locked. No one had sneaked in. He told himself that perhaps the house was old and made strange noises. But deep down, he felt that something was wrong. Melissa, the youngest daughter, began to show strange signs. She often talked to herself, her voice changing constantly, sometimes mumbling like a child, sometimes shrill and harsh like an adult. One evening, while Kathy was feeding Melissa, she suddenly stared into space behind her mother, then said hoarsely, "You don't belong here. Leave." Kathy turned around in surprise, but saw no one. The strange phenomena increased in frequency and severity. Objects moved by themselves, floated in the air, then fell and shattered. Doors opened and closed by themselves unexpectedly. The temperature in the room changed suddenly, sometimes freezing cold, sometimes sweltering hot. The Baker family lived in extreme fear. One morning, while George was shaving in the bathroom, he suddenly saw the shadow of a tall man in black standing right behind him in the mirror. He quickly turned around, but there was no one. He looked back in the mirror, and the shadow reappeared, with bloodshot, hateful eyes. George screamed in panic, dropping the razor on the floor. Kathy could not bear it any longer. She decided to seek help from a priest. Father Adams, a middle-aged man with a kind face, listened to Kathy's story with a serious expression. He promised to go to the Baker house to check on the situation. But neither Kathy nor Father Adams expected that what awaited them at 112 Ocean Avenue was more terrible than they could have imagined. A few days after Kathy's distress call, one late afternoon, Father Adams arrived at 112 Ocean Avenue. As he stepped inside, he was immediately struck by the cold, gloomy atmosphere. Although there was still a faint yellow light outside, the inside of the house seemed to be engulfed in darkness. Kathy Baker, her eyes dark from lack of sleep and worry, hurried out to greet Father Adams. Her voice was choked as she said, "Thank you for coming. We really don't know what to do." George Baker stood beside his wife, his face tense. looking at the priest suspiciously. "Father, I'm not sure if this has anything to do with religion, but we've tried everything." Father Adams smiled kindly, placing his hand on George's shoulder. "I understand your skepticism, but sometimes there are forces that science cannot explain. Let me take a look at the situation." He followed Kathy into the living room, where the furniture was still in disarray from the night's terrors. An armchair was overturned, and the broken pieces of a vase were scattered on the floor. As Father Adams prayed silently, a loud noise came from upstairs. It was the sound of hurried footsteps, as if someone was running. Daniel and Christopher, the two Baker boys, turned pale and hugged each other. "There, Father, it's starting again," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. Father Adams signaled for everyone to be quiet. He slowly walked up the stairs, listening for every sound. The footsteps stopped in front of Melissa's bedroom door. Then, a shrill voice, not a child's voice, rang out. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The voice was full of spite and anger, sending a chill down Father Adams' spine. He gently opened the door. Melissa was sitting on the bed, her body trembling, her eyes rolling back. She stared at Father Adams. But those eyes were not the eyes of a child. They contained the ferocity, the resentment of a dark soul. "Go away. This is not a place for you," Melissa screamed, her voice hoarse. Suddenly, the wardrobe in the room shook violently, then collapsed to the floor, dust flying everywhere. A cold wind blew through the room, carrying with it an unpleasant stench. Father Adams felt an evil presence enveloping this room. He began to recite the prayer, his voice resolute in the chaos. As Father Adams' prayer rang out, Melissa screamed in pain, clutching her head. Red scratches appeared on her face and arms, as if someone was scratching her flesh. The furniture in the room began to float, spinning wildly. Kathy and George stood at the door, horrified at the scene before them. Kathy burst into tears, calling out her daughter's name. The climax was when the chandelier on the ceiling shook violently, then fell down, shattering into hundreds of pieces right in front of Father Adams. He dodged in time, but the flying glass shards scratched his hand slightly. Looking at Melissa's still rolling eyes, Father Adams knew that this was not an ordinary phenomenon. There was a dark force haunting this house, and it was trying to destroy the Baker family. He thought to himself, this battle would be long and dangerous. After the terrible incident with the chandelier, Father Adams knew that he could not deal with this evil force alone. He decided to stay overnight to observe and learn more about the phenomena happening in the house. The Baker family, although still very scared, felt a little hope with the presence of the priest. That night, after putting the children to sleep, Kathy and George sat with Father Adams in the living room. The air still smelled of dust and was strangely cold. Kathy trembled as she recounted what they had experienced in the past few days, her voice breaking with emotion. "We couldn't sleep, Father. Whenever we closed our eyes, we saw dark shadows lurking, heard scary whispers." George sat silently, occasionally nodding to confirm his wife's words. Father Adams listened attentively, occasionally asking questions to better understand the course of events. He was particularly interested in Melissa's strange words and actions. When these phenomena began, was there anything unusual about Melissa? For example, changes in personality or habits? Kathy thought for a moment and then answered, "Actually, before this, Melissa was a very good and cheerful child. But about a week before everything started, she became quieter, spoke less, and often looked into the dark corners of the house. Suddenly, A loud noise came from upstairs, as if someone was throwing something heavy on the floor. All three of them startled and turned their heads to look at the stairs. George stood up, looking worried. "I'll go check." Father Adams stopped him. "Let me go. You stay here with Kathy and the children." He carried the cross and a holy water bottle, and slowly walked up the stairs. When Father Adams reached Melissa's bedroom door, the door was slightly open. He gently pushed the door open and entered. The room was dark, with only the faint moonlight shining through the window. A strong stench filled his nose, making it hard for him to breathe. Melissa was curled up on the bed, shivering. But what terrified Father Adams was that on the opposite wall, strange scrawls appeared, as if someone had scratched them with their fingernails. The words were written in a dark red liquid that looked like blood. Father Adams moved closer, trying to read the words. They were written in ancient Latin, and when translated, they had a terrifying meaning. "Leave, trespasser. This soul belongs to me." His heart sank. He knew that this was not just a joke or a natural phenomenon. There was a real evil force occupying this house. At that moment, a cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candle Father Adams had just lit. Darkness enveloped the room, leaving only the dim moonlight. A hoarse, creepy laugh rang out from the corner of the room, as if mocking his fear. Father Adams clutched the cross in his hand, chanting continuously. Suddenly, an invisible force pushed Father Adams hard in the back, sending him tumbling to the floor. The cross flew out of his hand. He tried to stand up, but a cold, bony hand grabbed his ankle, pulling him back into the darkness. He felt a terrible pain spread throughout his body, as if thousands of needles were piercing his flesh. In desperation, Father Adams struggled and called for help. His screams echoed downstairs, causing Kathy and George to run upstairs in panic. When they opened Melissa's bedroom door, the scene before their eyes horrified them. Father Adams lay motionless on the floor, his body convulsing, his mouth foaming. As for Melissa, she was floating in the air, her eyes white, her mouth wide open as if screaming something extremely terrible. Kathy and George rushed into the room, their screams tearing apart the silence. Witnessing the horrifying scene of Father Adams and his little daughter floating in the air, they completely collapsed. George hurriedly supported Father Adams, calling him in vain, but the priest still lay motionless, breathing weakly. Kathy, in a state of extreme panic, tried to grab Melissa's legs, but an invisible force pushed her backwards. Melissa was still floating, her small body torn apart by an invisible force. Her face was distorted, no longer the usual innocence, but instead a ferocious, terrifying hatred. A hoarse voice, not Melissa's, echoed throughout the room. "You cannot stop me. This soul belongs to the darkness." George, although very scared, but the love for his child helped him regain a bit of his senses. He hugged Kathy, who was sobbing, trying to calm his wife. "We have to do something. Kathy, we can't let this continue." Kathy looked up at her husband with tearful eyes, desperately saying, "But what can we do? We are completely helpless." At that moment, Father Adams stirred slightly, a soft groan escaping from his throat. His eyes slowly opened, staring at the ceiling. Although he was still very weak, he still tried to raise his hand, tightly grasping the cross that George had picked up and given him. In a weak voice, he said, "We must pray." Hearing Father Adams' words, Kathy and George seemed to find the last ray of hope. They knelt down beside the priest, praying together. The prayers rang out, initially shaky and weak, but gradually became stronger and more determined. As the prayers echoed throughout the house, Melissa began to show signs of pain. She screamed, her body jerked, and slowly fell onto the bed. As Melissa lay still on the bed, Father Adams tried to sit up, leaning against the wall. His face was pale, sweat pouring out like a shower. He looked at Kathy and George, his voice still very weak. "We need to find out why this spirit haunts this house." All three of them did not sleep that night. They prayed together, thinking about what had happened. Father Adams told them about the poltergeist cases he had encountered, about souls trapped between two worlds, unable to move on. He suspected that some terrible tragedy had occurred in this house, and that the souls of the deceased were trying to communicate with the outside world. The next morning, Father Adams decided to conduct a thorough investigation into the history of the house. He asked George to contact the previous owners, looking for information that would help them better understand the secrets hidden in 112 Ocean Avenue. Kathy stayed home to take care of the children, but fear was always present in her eyes. While George was out looking for information, Kathy stayed home with Father Adams and the children. Suddenly, strange phenomena began to recur. Strange noises rang out everywhere. Furniture moved by itself, and Melissa began to act strangely. She spoke nonsense, her tone constantly changing, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. At one point, while Kathy was trying to coax Melissa to take her medicine, she suddenly grabbed her mother's hand, her eyes wide open, looking straight into Kathy's eyes. In a cold, unfamiliar voice, Melissa said, "You cannot save me. I belong to the darkness forever." That sentence made Kathy shiver. An extreme fear invaded her heart. She knew that they were facing an evil force stronger than they could imagine. After many attempts, George Baker finally contacted a few people who had lived in the house at 112 Ocean Avenue before. The information he gathered shocked both the family and Father Adams. It turned out that the house had been the site of a horrific massacre many years before. The first former owner George contacted was an elderly woman named Martha, who lived in a neighboring town. Martha recounted with a trembling voice that in the 1960s, the house had been owned by the DeFeo family. One night, Ronald DeFeo Jr., the eldest son of the family, suddenly used a gun to kill his father, mother, and 4 younger siblings right in this house. "I still remember that terrible night clearly," Martha said, her voice choking. There was continuous gunfire. Then there was an eerie silence. The whole town was shocked by this incident. George continued to search and contacted several other people who had rented or visited the house after the massacre. All of them recounted terrifying experiences and supernatural phenomena they had witnessed. A man named John said he had rented the house in the early 1970s. But he could only stay there for a few weeks because he couldn't stand the strange noises and the constant feeling of being watched. "I always felt like someone was watching me, even when no one was there," John said, still looking scared as he recalled it. "Sometimes I would hear creepy whispers in my ear." When George brought this information home, Kathy and Father Adams were horrified. They began to understand why the house was so haunted. The spirits of those who died in the massacre were probably still trapped here, trying to contact the outside world, or even taking out their anger on the people living in the house. With this new information, Father Adams decided to perform an exorcism on the house. He believed that if he could appease the tormented spirits, they would find peace and leave the house forever. He prepared the necessary items for the ritual, including holy water, a Bible, candles, and a cross. Late one night, when the full moon was shining, Father Adams began the exorcism ritual in the living room, which was said to be the place where the most strange phenomena occurred. Kathy and George stood beside him, praying together. The air in the room became colder than ever. A strong fishy smell permeated the space. As Father Adams began to recite the exorcism prayers, horrifying phenomena began to occur. The furniture in the room shook violently. The paintings on the wall fell and shattered. A strong wind blew through, extinguishing all the candles. Darkness enveloped the room, leaving only the faint moonlight shining through the window. Suddenly, a terrifying voice rang out from the darkness. "You have no right to chase us away. This place is ours." That voice was not Melissa's, but a man's voice, full of anger and hatred. Kathy and George hugged each other tightly, looking into the darkness in horror. Then, an invisible force attacked Father Adams, knocking him to the floor. The cross flew out of his hand. He tried to stand up, but a black shadow appeared right in front of him, with bloodshot, threatening eyes. That shadow growled incomprehensible words. But Father Adams felt its evil and terrible power. He knew that this battle would be very fierce and dangerous. In the darkness, Father Adams tried to stand up, his face full of determination, even though he knew that the force facing him was extremely strong. He still did not waver. He picked up the cross, clasped it in his hand, and began to recite prayers in a powerful voice that echoed throughout the room. As Father Adams's prayer rang out, the shadow in front of him growled angrily, then rushed towards him at a terrifying speed. Father Adams raised the cross high, pointing at the shadow. A piercing scream rang out, and the shadow retreated, as if pushed back by an invisible force. Kathy and George, although very scared, still tried to stay calm and prayed together with Father Adams. Their prayers blended together, forming a solid wall, resisting the attack of evil forces. The moonlight outside the window suddenly became bright, shining into the room, dispelling some of the darkness. Melissa, who was still lying motionless on the bed, suddenly opened her eyes. Her eyes were no longer terrifyingly white, but had returned to normal. Clear and bewildered, she looked around the room, then softly called out, "Mommy, Daddy." Kathy and George rushed to their daughter's side, hugging her tightly. Meanwhile, Father Adams continued to pray, his voice growing stronger and more determined. The darkness seemed to be weakening, the angry growls fading. A white light enveloped the room, dispelling all the darkness and coldness. As the light faded, the darkness disappeared completely. The room returned to its normal state, strangely quiet. The furniture stopped shaking. The strange noises disappeared. Only the faint scent of holy water and half-burned candles remained. Father Adams breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that they had won. The evil forces had been repelled, at least for the time being. He looked at Kathy and George, who were holding Melissa tightly, their faces filled with joy and gratitude. "Your family is safe," Father Adams said, his voice still a little tired. "But remember, darkness is always lurking. Always keep faith and pray. That is the strongest weapon against evil." Kathy and George nodded. They understood that what they had just experienced was a painful lesson. The next morning, the Baker family decided to leave 112 Ocean Avenue. They could not continue to live in a place that had caused so much horror and suffering for them. Although they knew that the memories of those terrifying nights would haunt them for a long time, they believed that, with unity and faith, they would overcome everything. The haunted house still stood there, silent and cold, but the Baker family brought hope and peace back to their lives. The story of the Baker family and the poltergeist phenomenon at 112 Ocean Avenue had ended. This is one of the most famous ghost cases in America, and to this day, the mysteries surrounding it have not been completely solved. If you find this story interesting and want to hear more true horror stories, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye and see you in the next videos.